Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders, 2025 Regional Edward R. Murrow Award winner for Best Podcast. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee.
Well, as we're talking here right now, our federal lawmakers are seemingly very close to a conclusion on how to reopen the government. But the longest lasting shutdown on record, at least 42 days as we record this here right now. It isn't just historic DC dysfunction, but it is also being felt here in New Mexico. We've had a front row seat seeing tens of thousands of workers furloughed or working without pay, and hundreds of thousands of New Mexicans seeing critical federal benefits halted or delayed.
Yeah, the Fed's Office of Personnel Management says more than 22,000 New Mexicans were considered federal civilian employees as of September 2024. Some of those workers, like air traffic controllers and airport security at the Sunport, for example, they worked the entire shutdown without receiving a paycheck. Those who worked and others who were furloughed are expected to receive back pay at this point.
Yeah, and even with that back pay, we know there's a ton of pressure on workers to find support elsewhere. We also mentioned the reduction or delay of federal benefits like SNAP, for example. That's something the state stepped in to help pay for.
Yeah, and with this kind of unprecedented shutdown this week, we wanted to take a closer look at just how this is impacting New Mexico, from the workers to the state's response, lawmakers' response, and some historic actions to fill in federal gaps.
Yeah, let's bring in our guest this week, returning to the podcast for the first time in about 3 years.
We just discovered this.
Figured this out on the exact timing.
Yeah.
Finance professor and associate dean of teaching and learning at the University of New Mexico Anderson School of Management, Professor Reilly White, is here with us. Thanks for being here.
It's a great joy to be here today, especially talking about a topic as important as this one.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I guess I just wanted to say, before we jump in here, Professor White, I want to get your take on the shutdown at sort of a high level. You heard how we described it: historic dysfunction, historic impact on New Mexico. What is your take on the effect of the shutdown? How do you summarize what you've seen?
So one of the things that you have to look at the end of the day is just how important and how big the federal workforce is to the state of New Mexico individually. So depending on the source you use, we have about 30,000 or so federal employees. If you extend that in a more broader extent to include things like contractors, people who are associated in other ways and other elements of the workforce, you can extend that number to 70,000. That's what the National Treasury Employee Union actually says for that number. And this represents, even at the 30,000 level, about 3.5% of our workforce in the state. And so looking at the federal size in New Mexico, you've got one dimension. High-level stuff in general, when you have 42 days of uncertainty, or that long of a government shutdown where you have 6 to 7 weeks of continuous uncertainty involving the economy, that sets all of those things that the federal government does or takes part in, ranging from benefits for ordinary New Mexicans, but also furloughed employees to the tune of 18,000 perhaps in New Mexico, delayed paychecks, delayed spending. That affects tax takings, that affects revenues, that affects contracts. Even if you're looking at something like Los Alamos National Labs alone, they have about $1 billion of direct contracts with local New Mexican businesses in a given year, and that slows all that process down. It halts it, people wait, people delay spending. Yeah. And at the end of the day, those impacts multiply and multiply and multiply. So there's the job impact side of this, there's the tax revenue impact side of this, and the third piece of this are those benefit side impacts, especially around SNAP et al., which we've had to grapple with in the last few weeks.
Your background, let's just remind viewers who you are and what kind of work you do also. What kind of research do you do as a professor, and how does the government shutdown come into play in things that you pay attention to?
That's right. So I'm a professor of finance, but I do a lot of other additional work in that field across economics. I do a lot of applied research. I do some consultation with cities and towns around revenue projections and GRT and tax analyses. And so we do a lot of calculations of economic impact. We do a lot of work that studies how different parts of the economy influence New Mexico's economic development. And so what you find in this as whole is you find over the last 100 years or so, New Mexico has been punching above its weight in terms of its federal exposure, the exposure of its government, of our people to sort of the federal workforce, the size of that government. We have a bunch of other characteristics about us that are very, very interesting to note. We've always been, in the post-war period in particular, heavily built around the military side, the industrial side, the national lab side. We're a very unique state that way. Our state as an economy, think of 2.1 million people, we don't have a lot of publicly traded companies, one of the fewest, in fact, of any state. We don't have that big private sector. Making up for that side is our public sector, which touches, almost a third of our overall workforce if we include state and local employees in that amount. And that means, when it comes to dynamics of how our employment markets move, that we often hire slower than other places, but we fire slower in recessions as well. And so this dynamic interplays a lot of everything in the state, the nature of how economic stimuli might pass through the government into the hands of the people, or in the nature of how economic growth happens for the state and other things. And so you've got a very, very unique situation here that we can't really apply out of state in many other places in the country. And it really is a story that's all our own.
Yeah. I think broadly, one could make a statement, and I'm sure there's some that would disagree with it, but basically, modern New Mexico is very much a product of the federal government, is what it seems. What do you think?
I think that's a very astute statement. I think you're absolutely right, Chris. And so, in thinking about that too, if you look at the way we're structured, the way we're looking at this, if we were to divide the state into two big pillars, you'd have oil and gas on one side, you'd have the federal government on another, and it's a fascinating dynamic in either of those places, right? Yep. And so both are economic drivers and both provide different revenue sources for the state, and in ways that we don't see very similarly with other states. And so occupying this middle space has a huge impact on us when we think about questions that are really fundamental. How do we improve the quality of life? How do we improve the standard of living? How do we get more New Mexicans employed, or how do we coordinate educational efforts and try all of this stuff? And so it's a question. One, superficially, we break everything down in economics and finance about money, but it is to that broader extent. It's sociocultural. It's a phenomenon that is definitive, I think, of the state as a whole. Just this overall interaction.
And just throwing this admittedly random question at you, but is there a state that you could point to similarly sized to New Mexico that maybe isn't quite as reliant on the federal government?
So that's true. So actually, if you look at basically any of our neighboring states, we could fall that into that category for different reasons. And then you've got Colorado, which doesn't have that same military or lab complex that we have, or DOE presence. Mm-hmm. You've got states like Arizona and Texas that are skewed much more towards the private sector. They have very large and dynamic private sector industries that are often publicly traded. We don't possess those here in that same way. And so it's very interesting to follow our economic development over the last 150 years. On a side note, compared to our neighboring states, we have that much bigger proportion of our government involvement in those capacities, and so far a lot of that comes with the good and the bad. So if you have a situation and you're, for instance, graduating a student population, and like I'm in the field of education, and outcomes are highly important in my line of work, we look for things like where students being placed and where are their jobs oriented. Are they entrepreneurial? Are they starting firms? Or what are they doing? And so here in New Mexico, we note that, if we look at some of our really big, the big places where students go, they are associated with stuff like the national labs. They're associated with stuff like that are involved at least partially through DOE or government-based projects. And that's really good. And it also does, so you have all of this intelligence going to these incredible organizations that do amazing things. But you also don't have that other side of it, which is, it's good because it keeps people in the state, keeps them working here, and it does, it provides good salaries. But we also don't have that as dynamic and entrepreneurial market as we might have in other states either. Yeah. So the students who are going here, getting those government jobs, they often aren't going out and saying, I'm going to found a new company that'll be a Fortune 500 company. So I think that dynamic plays into it too. And so it's really, so when we talk about shutdowns, I know we kind of exploded that outward a little bit, and we kind of overextended that horizon. You can see just uniquely in this state how important stuff like the federal government is in the way that we look at things. And, tying it together, you're looking at a significant economic impact, bringing it down to the shutdown area. Average wage of a federal employee is about $1,867 a week in New Mexico. If we multiply that by the last 5 or 6 weeks that we've had this issue, you're estimating at delayed paychecks to the tune of about $36 million a week, almost $200 million or more that people have not been paid that they should have been paid. Even if we reduce that furloughed number a little bit, and that includes that's estimating about 18,000 people furloughed.
Yeah.
That's a huge impact to the state. Our whole state's annual gross domestic product is about $113 billion. So,
Wow.
I want to dive a little bit into the federal workforce numbers. I know you presented some numbers that are actually a little bit bigger than the ones that I had researched and found, but a September 2024 count from the Office of Personnel Management showing New Mexico had nearly 22,700 employees on the Fed's civilian side. Congresswoman Melanie Stansberry, during one of the last shutdowns, she put out an estimate indicating there's about 11,000 military members in our state.
Yeah, so there was an estimate of at least 30,000 people if you use those numbers. You said, if you include contractors and everything, you can get that number upwards of 70,000 with federal employment connections in New Mexico. How extensive, I know you've said that, but how extensive does our federal workforce remain in New Mexico compared to some of those other states that we're talking about?
Oh, yeah. So we actually, if you look at it percentage-wise, we are significantly higher than the average bear when it comes to state concentrations. Only a few states have higher concentrations of federal employees than us, many around the D.C. area. Look at Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. itself. And then you've got some areas with significant base presence and military presence. What makes New Mexico unique, I think, is the fact we've got these 2 large placeholder national laboratories in Los Alamos and Sandia that are associated with, of course, the DOE and in that broader extent that just don't exist in that same fashion. I know there's 17 or so other laboratories across the country that are also involved, but as a proportion of the population and as an impact, they have an outsized impact here in New Mexico. And then you have the association, as we said, of contractors too, people whose day-to-day they're not explicit federal employees, they work on federal contracts, or maybe a % of their wages work on federal contracts. So those deals, which normally pass through after the October 1st fiscal year begins, often don't get passed. Those contracts get delayed. There's a lot of uncertainty there. And those workers also are affected. And different individual private companies are also having to make these tough adjustments while they figure out and say, hey, are you going to fund my contract next year, or do I have to look somewhere else for this to happen?
Yeah, we were just talking to someone along those lines, an attorney actually who does contract work with the government.
You would never think that by nature that would be an attorney, but it affects attorneys. It affects a whole slew of occupations outside of that federal scope here in the state.
It's wild. So when it comes to broader economic effect of the shutdown, this is what I want to get your take on as well. With this many federal workers in New Mexico, what are we seeing as far as economic data that ends up having, the effect on the general churn of the economy in our state? Like I'm thinking, missed paychecks, reduced spending. What are you looking at?
This is a great question. And so let's say, out of those workers, let's say, and let's whether it's 22,000, 30,000, and looking at different aggregates, and the same Office of Personnel Management also has, of course, we also have something like 27,000 or so annuitants. People are retired, but they should be all right in that sense. So when we look at the size of the economic impact, there's the question of delayed spending. Now, when you look at delayed spending, it doesn't mean that, I'm not being paid, so I can't spend any more money. People are going to be drawing from their savings and spending less of their money that they were before.
Right.
So, but we don't know, and it will depend entirely on the individual family. Now, I look at aggregates right now, right? Savings rates across the United States aren't particularly high right now. We don't have nuanced data for New Mexico specifically, but it's about 3 to 4% of a paycheck will go into some type of savings. Not enough necessarily, and we undersave as a population. So when you encounter this, imagine going, and if you aren't in that sector, if you aren't in a federal government sector, imagine going suddenly, let's say for the purposes of this, 6 full weeks without a paycheck. So how would your individual living expenses differ? So you'd slow down your spending. So whatever you were booking, that discretionary spending comes first. So those extra trips, that vacation, that weekend you had, probably you're going to cancel and wait until there's some certainty on that paycheck.
Not going out to eat. Buying your kid that toy they wanted, whatever it might
And that affects our restaurant industries. And that affects this huge hospitality industry we have in the state. And then you've got the individual levels so the individual consumption is affected. People take on temporary debt. The hope is that it's temporary and to account for some of the spending. Because it's very hard. Most families in New Mexico, as well as everywhere else, we have very limited savings budgets in the state, which means that even going 6 weeks and even earning an income or the average income of a federal employee, living expenses, are such a significant factor. It's hard not to cut back or to engage in some type of credit card or debt spending. Average New Mexican has about $6,000 in credit card debt right now. That's a lot of money, in fact. And you see, I would expect that this area and federal workers looking at this and trying to extend their spending are going to be focused on that as well. Now, they will get paid, hopefully, when the government reopens at some point this week or at some future time, but then they still have to then discipline themselves enough to say, wait, I spent this much, I had this much extra debt, and I got to put that back on my credit card. Right. And fiscally, we find that typically that's ideal, but people often fall a little behind in interesting ways. That's federal employee side. That's aggregate spending. That's to the tune of, so if we look at delayed expenditures, all that stuff, upper tens of millions of dollars of impact, probably from the cuts across the state, probably closing in on $100 million, I would say, in aggregate impact, just from people reducing spending slightly. Then you have all of those other stuff, all those other effects. So it's the restaurants that are losing business. It's the places it's places like our national parks, right, which draw in that support around 2,000 employees across the state in different ways and in supportive structures and tourism industry, and they spend a couple $100 million a year at New Mexico national parks. You have those employees in varying levels of services that they're able to provide, and some closures and other things that have to happen, and that takes it out of the market. And then you've got all the federal workers. So you've got this little domino effect where it's not merely just singularly set upon people are delayed in paycheck. It's suddenly I have to look at my workers and doing all these things. And then you have one of the most nefarious stuff. So if you're a city like Albuquerque, city like Santa Fe, huge section of your revenue stream is gross receipts taxes. That comes from spending. So if spending drops, you would see that impact in GRT. Yeah. Now we're about, when the RP 500s are released, there's like a 2-month delay on that. So we'll know what the October data is in December, basically. Right. But we should see an impact there, especially on tax takings for cities. Whether that's made up in the holiday season will make a big difference in a lot of municipal budgets as well. And so if people are cutting back, they're not doing their holiday shopping, they're worried about this hitting right at the season, they just don't have the money to make that extent. Are they going to spend that money in mass when they get that first paycheck rolling in November? Sure. Or are they going to have to be like, oh my gosh, it forces one into really think thoughtfully about their budget and their expenditures for the year. Yeah, it is an immense amount of stress for New Mexico families. Yeah. Those are the ones directly affected by those impacts. And on the SNAP side, that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah, I was going to say that was one of the next areas we wanted to move into. One of the most arguably or arguably the most talked about effects of the shutdown was those SNAP benefits, or has been the SNAP benefits, money for food assistance. Just so as a reminder to folks, 1 month into the shutdown, the Trump administration basically said SNAP benefits would stop being paid out on the federal side. Well, all of that was challenged in court. New Mexico leaders here and state government, they stepped in. The governor signed 40 executive orders in one day to get $30 million released of SNAP funding just to cover 10 days of benefits into November. Then after the 10th day, special session hits where lawmakers step in and they put $162 million into basically a special fund saying, hey, if this isn't resolved, we'll have that $162 million that'll be available through basically mid-January to pay for these benefits in full. Seems like an incredibly expensive undertaking. I think the governor kind of alluded to that when she signed the executive orders at first, saying this is not something the states can cover on their own. But I guess just to ask you the question, what are the financial pressures that kind of move puts on a state like New Mexico?
It's true, and the conversation would be vastly different if we didn't run a budget surplus due to our oil and gas severance taxes at all right now.
Yeah.
So because we have the extra money, and there's a debate that we can have among finance and economics people, how long will this last? Will this be a long-term gain that will benefit New Mexico? Should we spend a little more from that? Or on the other side of the question, are we going to look more like Alaska does, where they had this surge of interest in the 80s and 90s, an explosion of production, and that since trailed off quite substantially. Only about a quarter of the oil that Alaska produced in the early 90s is actually produced today. And so oil is an international commodity, and it comes from, that's a whole other issue about it. It
comes out. Flows.
It ebbs and flows. That's exactly right. It comes out of the ground wherever it's cheapest to distribute and bring it out. And so and that's enabled us to have this conversation. Now, when you think about SNAP benefits overall, so New Mexico, uniquely, we are the state with the highest percentage of people who are on SNAP benefits, about 21%. That's an extraordinarily high number, significant above the 12% national average or so when we look at SNAP benefits, and to the tune of, on average, of about $189 a week per person in food benefits. Now, that is a huge impact. Now, there's a few ways to look at this, right? There is the actual cost of it and the economic impact of what that means. And economic impact have both short-term and long-term implications. And so looking at this, let's break it down. So $189 a week, what does that do? It supports, obviously, people buying food and a bunch of, and because of the system that they do, there's been some development and evolution of the SNAP system. But when people have cards that enable them to pay for this, it's not immediately evident to people that they're paying for SNAP benefits. As opposed to years ago when you had individual food coupons for it, and they'd whip it out at the grocery store, and then you'd have these things. Yeah. And
so, stamp era.
So many people here in New Mexico are like, I didn't know that 1 out of every 5 people are using SNAP. Of course, we're using this. There's a huge amount of food insecurity in the state, and it's so important for a lot of families. And so then you look at this $189 bill, and that goes to grocery spending. And there's been economic research that shows that every dollar spent has a multiplying factor. People end up buying more food than they might otherwise do with using SNAP and other benefits. Now, superficially, is this a bad thing, good thing? Food security is important because in the long run, when we think of what that impact does in the long run, we have better outcomes. So for instance, when we look at SNAP families, or research was done on SNAP families, teenagers taking the SAT test, right? Super hard, they got to study for it. They've got to engage it that way. At the beginning of the month, when the SNAP benefits are paid, the family has food. They do better on those tests than they do at the end of the month. And so at the end of the month, those SNAP benefits, that food money goes away. They're more food insecure. Those scores go down, and this has been shown. That's one of the other things that's fascinating about providing food benefits, is that it provides important neurological and nutritional impacts for children. And that is the most fundamental thing. And we skew this question on economics as to who benefits most from SNAP benefits. And the vast majority of people who benefit are low income. They're in households that are not earning a lot of money, and they possess significant amounts of food insecurity. And across New Mexico, we have large areas that aren't well serviced by a diverse array of grocery stores outside of Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Las Cruces, Roswell, big cities. We have what is effectively a food desert in many places, where they just don't have access to those commodities in large amounts. Yeah. And so providing that becomes a critical portion. So it is a significant upfront cost. Now, back to the question about state funding, not something even New Mexico can sustain at that level for a long run. Yeah. So if we were to extrapolate that $160 million to the end of the year, or that sum through the end of the year, throughout the course of the year, the total amount of outlays in SNAP in New Mexico is about $1 billion. That would eat up a sizable amount of our discretionary budget, which is just for the state not sustainable in the long run. Yeah. And so it almost has to be federally done. And so this was a very important Band-Aid that the state was able to perform, but it's impossible for our state or any state fundamentally to engage that to the same level.
Yeah, that's what the governor said in her press conference. She's like, we'll spend this money now, but New Mexico and no other state can really sustain this sort of funding. It's a huge amount of money. So the cost for private businesses, we touched on this a little bit, but grocery stores, retailers impacted when SNAP funds run out. A lot of New Mexico grocery stores rely on that funding as part of their revenue stream. About 460,000 New Mexicans use SNAP benefit. It is the highest per capita rate in the nation, about 21% of our state's population. But especially I was looking at a map that was breaking this down by counties, especially in rural counties, where you said there are fewer grocery stores, and maybe they have a higher elderly population who is on SNAP benefits. I was looking at numbers where, close to 30% of like a specific county in New Mexico's population is on SNAP benefits. How are those places impacted, like as opposed to Albuquerque or Santa Fe?
Hugely so. That's a fantastic question. So the rural areas in particular, not only do they have a combination of declining demographics, they have older populations, they also have this, I think Catron County has close to, in median age, that is close to 60 right now of their population. You've got rural areas of the state that are highly exposed to, or have great exposure to very few grocery stores, a lack of availability of areas where one can purchase food, and also a population that does not have a significant access to a lot of economic activity or stores or other places. These are places that are often isolated. They're rural. They don't have the diversity of the economic situations that we have in the Rio Grande Valley, and so this combination, this dynamic, becomes key in kind of addressing some of these issues. And so when we think about New Mexico, it is that urban-rural divide. It's that Rio Grande Valley versus the rest of the state divide. But it's also something in SNAP benefits that help a lot of our rural populations, where food insecurity is a means of life. And then, if you work institutionally in large institutions like the University of New Mexico, a significant proportion of our student body is food insecure and housing insecure, and that's driven from those issues as well. And I would say to those, one of the important things to consider about just the economic cost of that and the importance of that is you want to reach a situation, of course, where you grow an economy and provide that development source, but you're also investing in a population in the future with providing them nutritional access in ways they wouldn't otherwise have, and that creates all these positive social implications in the long run. So not only better educational performance, but better, there's other research that shows the antisocial and social behaviors and how having proper nutrition as a child enables you to actually overcome or potentially overcome some of these issues. And so it's an investment in our long term, but as everything is, it's a question of, it is tough to balance in an era where we're constantly upfront about budget costs right now, and we're constantly making evaluations on short-term versus long-term over the long run. Short-term, you could cut them, absolutely, and the impacts would be found years later rather than days later, and it would be a significant impact. And so when we gauge questions like economic impact, we have to think about not only the short run, but the long run and all those benefits, the higher educational performance, the higher educational standards. And if you run this through, and I was honored to work on a study with a colleague at the University of New Mexico that studied the level of food insecurity at UNM. And because the research out there is significant and it shows that educational performance improves because of that, getting people through higher retention rates result in greater job opportunities. That multiplicative effect of providing people upfront money results in significantly better outcomes that any way you look at it, it pays for itself in time, despite being how expensive it is. Yeah. But then at the state level, from supporting that, you have all these competing interests, and the question for New Mexico in the next 30 years is what's the best ROI for the surplus that we're running right now? What's going to create the most positive impacts for the state? Is it economic development? Is it education? What do we do in this space is it a combination of all those things?
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
KRQE News 13 investigations. One of the biggest cons in New Mexico history. How did they get away with it?
Well, they had an accomplice. The state of New Mexico.
A road rage encounter leads to murder.
I miss him every single day.
Did the judicial system fail here?
New Mexico's families, homes, and lives are left in ashes.
There's a level of anxiety.
FEMA has been an abject and abysmal failure.
Watch anytime on krqe.com or our YouTube channel.
Yeah, I think we hear anecdotes about this, and I think it's become clear in our conversation that New Mexico has a reliance on federal investment, and to an extent, investment from the state government, as evidenced by the fact that they've filled the gap on SNAP funds, an important benefit there. But how do you sort of qualify or quantify the resilience that New Mexico has on the federal government? And what does the federal investment that we see now, what does it mean for New Mexico? Does it make New Mexico?
That's a great question. So one thing you could compare if you could compare us to other states that are similarly situated, let's say in the situation of that we have similar struggles. We have lower income, lack of large companies. So we can point out a bunch of other states, maybe Louisiana, maybe Mississippi, maybe Alabama, maybe West Virginia, the states that have, but they don't have near our population. Well, some states don't have near the population diversity or the elements at hand. We run on average, our average GDP is about 15 to 20% higher than it is in Mississippi or Alabama, for instance. And that's driven, I think, in large part due to the infrastructure of things like the labs, this government side of things in the state. So imagine if we snapped our fingers tomorrow and we said, guess what? There's going to be no federal presence in New Mexico. Ta-da, here's what we're going to do. And there are people out there who might say, well, that means that we'll pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we'll start, large companies and we'll have this thing. But we don't see that necessarily as evidence in other states that have that pressure. They just have a lower average income. And so it's an interesting perspective on this too. And it's certainly only part of the overall dynamic in this space. There is that question, the golden handcuffs question. Are we over-reliant on the question of the federal side in New Mexico? And I think, and there is an interplay here, and it's not a coincidence that I think that we have very few publicly traded companies. We have a population that's incredibly, we have so many well-educated people that work for the labs and other places, and brilliant people that come from across the state that engage and build our economy. Right. And so the question is, what are the resources available to us, and how do we build those resources? And for the federal government side of things, it is an amazing opportunity. And it's as much as, it's saying, this is wasteful, all those things. And there are certain ways that the federal government itself can be much more efficient. And I reiterate that. Absolutely. But when it comes down to its support for New Mexico in general, you're providing a network of, you're getting New Mexicans hooked into a very large federal infrastructure that enables them to have opportunities that go beyond the state. So I can quantify that and say for the state, it is itself important. But I would also then expose and say, you're giving, in the same way that if we had, 20 Fortune 500 companies appear tomorrow in New Mexico that offered, not even their headquarters, but really sizable presence here, you would have people start work there, and then they'd get work in other places of that government, and other places in the institutionally. They'd be work at their LA office or their New York office or something else. And in that same way, the federal government provides a ladder for a lot of people to build very, very, very critical careers across the economy, not affecting just New Mexico, but over the U.S. as a whole. Mm-hmm. And you see that with, we see that with students that graduate UNM, we see that with other NMSU, other places that have this input. And so this is where it comes down to. So if we were to quantify this input, we've got the labor force, we've got the actual federal benefits like SNAP, but we've also got this ethereal element. And I think the solution to this is probably greater, I would say greater rather than less than engagement between the federal government. There's a lot of public-private partnership interest. I know a lot of different areas are working locally on that kind of stuff, building companies out of there. And I know the labs have some very, very intriguing and economically really enticing places to combine their knowledge into startups in other places. And that ecosystem should probably grow. And then so if you're looking at the state level and your concern is, are we overly reliant on the federal government? And particularly in times like this, where there's shutdowns or there's uncertainty or the risk of cuts from an administration, I would say it's absolutely true that it benefits New Mexico to consider diversification of its economy through other means. And that is a very long-term process. It doesn't happen overnight. But,
I'm thinking, you're reminding me of another conversation we had on the podcast about the Space Force, who does a lot of private, private government partnerships, which is fascinating to learn about some of that stuff. Cool. But what kind of meaningful changes have you seen, have you seen any meaningful change over time getting us away from our reliance on federal funding in New Mexico? What does it look like realistically to have an economy here in our state that is less reliant on the feds?
So I think we have to embrace the question, and this is where the economics and finance side comes in a little bit more, the question of competition. And so for us in general, it's not bad to have competition. It's good to have competition. And so if you're a graduate and you've just graduated with your graduate degree from one of our institutions, or you've done this amazing work to get you there, first generation college student, you have choices in front of you, choices you've never had before, choices your parents didn't have. And you're going to look at the situation at the slew of jobs out there, and the federal jobs will look always incredibly appealing. They're everything that you've dreamed of they would be. They're a steady income. It's maybe a pension. It might be, an involvement in in an infrastructure in a space that makes a sizable difference in the state. What we need to do to create an economy that's effective is not merely just continue to provide these federal workers, but also provide other choices that go beyond that, right? And sometimes that is, the choice is so much better than other choices that people opt for that. And so what that looks like is an infrastructure of larger companies that come in. So people have a private sector, and the private sector and public sector, it's a type of friendly competition. So I'll give you an example. So why do, one of the questions people always ask economically is, what happens to workers when they move rurally to the big city? And they become more productive. They become about 50% more productive when they move to a big city. And why? Because there's competition, there's other workers there, other things happen. And then you've got like these areas like the Bay Area in California, or like Austin in the last few years, that have been these little entrepreneurial hubs, right? Why do the majority of startups, when they start up and ask for that big amounts of money, why do they locate in the Bay Area? Why don't they locate here? And the story is infrastructure. A company will locate to a place where it has a pool of talent that's massive, educated, and supports its pool. So if you're Google, you're going to locate in a place that's close to Apple, even though you're competing against one another in some spaces of your business. But you're going to operate in this space because you're going to say, hey, I can take your programmers, you can take my programmers, and that makes the ecosystem richer. It makes it more healthier. It boosts productivity, and at the end of the day, it produces overall outcomes in the economy. So if you were creating that in New Mexico, you can't just have public sector over here. You've got to create private sector enterprise as well. And ideally, we have a situation where private sector enterprise, government, and we think of all the workers that are involved in contractors, the startup businesses that work, and a little bit with the government. We have so many seeds that are sown right now in New Mexico that could grow into big trees. And so you develop this sector in such a way where you've got companies that maybe were focused on defense or space or everything else that are growing. They're private sector enterprises. They do a lot of contract work. But then they're here because they know the workforce is also here. And they know that they can choose. We'll have people leaving the labs for them, and we'll have people going to the labs from them. And that's going to make our ecosystem richer at the end of the day. And the hard part is getting that off the ground, which is a complex arrangement of policies, issues, and other concerns that extend beyond the question of the state. And it's keeping workers here. It's building our educational system so that families stay and they want to stay. And it's doing all these other things that make sense. Yeah. So that's
infrastructure is a long game.
It does feel like it is a reality or remotely possible, though. You talked about New Mexico having a lot of seeds sown right now.
Oh yeah, I 100%. And I want to say that overall, this is not the Reilly White nihilist podcast. This is one of those things that nothing matters.
Maybe we should start that though.
I still have, is that a side? Let's do that as a little side hustle.
That's right.
One of those things. So what I like about this though is you're absolutely right. And so these seeds are sown, and you have to have hope, because you look at this. I see it. You see it every day. We teach thousands of students, and they all have that same sparkle, that same intelligence. I've taught at other universities around the country. They're all there. They're still there. They're doing it, and people respond to the economic opportunities that they have in front of them. So it's key that we can help provide those as a state, and we have to associate not with a single mechanism, but many different mechanisms to make that a reality.
Okay. We've talked about, our governor and lawmakers jumping in to make sure SNAP didn't run out, for example, the trickle-down effect that has on our own state budget, to be seen, it seems like also. Do you see this as really, though, what they did here in New Mexico, lightening the impact of a federal shutdown? Like, did we avoid a real crisis here in your view?
Yes, I think so. So the benefit of the state stepping in for things like the SNAP benefits in particular I cannot underscore not only the reliability of providing that food security for, as a state, that 21% of our population that are using SNAP benefits, but you're also you're creating what we would call a bridge loan in finance. You're creating this, you're creating a way to go from funding regime to funding regime in a way that doesn't disrupt it, because disruptions have costs associated with them. So we know that in COVID, a lot of people lost their jobs. Those were costs. Some people got those jobs back quickly. Some people did not. If your food benefits that you were expecting fall off unexpectedly in October, what are your other options that you have in front of you? And it's very hard. You can adapt over the long run. If you said, we're getting rid of SNAP in 2035, the state will think of infrastructure and other ways to do it. But in the short run, there's just not enough infrastructure in place to provide those services. So what the SNAP does, it smooths it. It provides that funding, provides that key, those key elements to keep the these nutritional impacts and other things at a minimum. And it still has an impact. The mere aspect of where the funding is coming from and the change of that funding is a big deal, and a lot of families have to adjust to that. But that's key. But again, the key being is that how long could this go? We're on day 42? 42. If a deal isn't run right now, then another month, another 2 months. Certainly through the end of the year, we can afford that. But when we start next year, it seems unlikely. And then even then, with the shutdown plan right now, we have this tentative deal in place through January 30th. Yeah. Are we going to have the same conversation in February? Because there's still a shutdown, and that's a good question.
And this episode won't publish right away, so it very well could end before people are listening to this episode. But I feel like, talking to you still helps paint a picture of broad impacts, and it won't, ending the shutdown won't necessarily fix all of the things that we have discussed, right?
Still more to come and to see. It sounds like.
There it is. Wait till. That's the thing. January 30th, when this tentative bill runs out, we'll see if they come with a different bill that the parties can agree on, or if not, and we might be talking about this again in February or March.
Anything else we're missing, or you think people should better understand?
So this is a good question. I think overall, we have federal government, bottom line, outsized impact on the New Mexico economy, outsized impact on New Mexico employment. Uncertainty when it comes down to stuff like paychecks makes people in the long run not want to take federal jobs as much as they might otherwise do. But there is, and so it's essential in some places to think about, continuity in government as a source of not only paychecks from day to day, but associated with a large number of other businesses and economic activity in the state. And then building on that economic activity in the state and helping diversify our infrastructure in future years, I think would be very prudent and expedient, I would say, for New Mexico to do across a large number of mechanisms. But we've got a lot of people thinking about this right now, and I'm optimistic about our future.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing some of those thoughts with us over the last hour here. We appreciate it, Professor Reilly White. Thanks for joining us. Again, a special thanks to Professor Reilly White from the UNM Anderson School of Management for taking some time to really, I think, exemplify just how impactful a shutdown is for New Mexico.
Yeah, and again, even if, things could change on any given day, the trickle-down effect of not only economics, but some of the other data points he touched on is really fascinating to learn about. But if you all have any story ideas or topics, people you'd like to hear from on our show, always feel free and reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and gburknm on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV, also Chris.McKee@krqe.com. Thanks for watching and listening.